our last talk today, it would not be a post-COVID conference if we didn't have at least part of it live. So I'd like to, or part of it digital, sorry. Part of it live. So I'd like to welcome Bjarne Jensen, who is the Senior Project Manager for the Danish Architecture Centre's Strategic Urban Governance Program. You've trained over 300 plus top-level Danish leaders from Danish municipality to be better leaders looking towards the sustainable and green transition. Previous to your work with the Danish Architecture Centre, Bjarne, you were the director of RegLab in Denmark and head of regional development at Oxford Research in Denmark. So, welcome, Bjarne. I hope I'm looking in your general direction to the camera, but I look forward to hearing what you're working with across Denmark, and to hear some reflections from Denmark today in pursuit influencing leaders in the green urban transition. Welcome.
Thank you very much. And I'll just try to share my screen. Hope that's there. Thanks a lot. And sorry, very sorry that I couldn't be with you. It looks a grand stage, and I would really have loved to be there. And the reason why I couldn't is because I'm traveling so much these days. So I've been to Jutland just yesterday and looking into sustainable urban development with a bunch of politicians from a couple of municipalities. So that's basically also what I want to talk to you about today. The Strategic Urban Governance Program is actually about leading cities. That's what we do, is trying to get the senior directors for all the municipalities in Denmark to think about what makes a good city, looking across all the areas that we know is attracting investments, creating housing for people, inclusion, climate change, CO2 emissions, architecture, urban space, everything that constitutes a good city. Who is it that takes charge of making sure that there's a coherence there? And that's basically what we try to do, is to make them think about the leadership they have, because they have a massive role, both the politicians and the CEOs for the municipalities, in making sure that we get good cities, because this is really long-term development. So we have these programs where we get them together for seminars and study trips for 1 or some of them for 3 years together, and trying to reflect on how we do this in a better way. And when we talk about sustainable urban development, then the task is really obvious, isn't it? This is how many of us live. We take up a lot of space. We're a growing population in Denmark. So if we continue doing things like this, where we take too much space, too many resources, too much energy consumption, too much everything, it just doesn't work. So we have to think differently for the future. I've been co-editing a publication called Designing the Irresistible Circular Society together with the Danish Design Center and Blocks Hub, and there's a chapter there particularly focusing on cities or neighborhoods, how we can think about circularity, not just as a product or a service, but even think about a whole city or a whole neighborhood. And that's what I want to focus on here also. So some of these things everyone will be familiar with. So this is an area in Copenhagen, which you could find pretty much everywhere. There's a lot of asphalt, a lot of space for cars. We need to deal with that in a way where we think differently. You also need to cope with all the water, and our sewage system can't take all the water when we have heavy rainfall. So this is an area where we can go and see how that is actually, I've just shifted the screen, I'll shift back. It is exactly the same area that you see. So that's been changed. It looks pretty from the top. It's got all these contraptions underneath that for retaining the water, making sure that we hold back the water so it doesn't put too much pressure on our sewage system. But it's also creating a much better space. As you can see, all the buildings around there is still pretty boring, so it's not changed that. But by doing simple things, we can actually change the fabric of the city. So that's an example that I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. What I want to focus on here is a whole precinct. This is a new town called Nye, as many of you will know, in Danish that means new, but that was actually the name of a very small community out here was called Ny before. So this is outside the city of Aarhus, and I'm sure most of you, when you look at that, you might think, well, this does not look particularly sustainable because it's greenfield. What happens is in Aarhus, they do a lot of, there's a population growth, so they do a lot of densification along the commuter lines, and they do a lot of brownfield densification, but they also they need more space, and here they've taken a plot of land outside the city, but it is on a commuter train line, and changing that from basically from nature, you might say, but it's actually containing a lot of things that has to do with sustainability and biodiversity, but also social sustainability, because I want to put that into this equation also, that is not just about the environment, it's about creating neighborhoods that really take good care of people. And that's what we want to do when we say the irresistible circular society. We want to make it irresistible because we want to make circularity something that people will want, not something that they feel that they have to do, and it gives them a lower quality of life. So I'll talk a little bit about this area. So the whole new city is eventually going to be 10,000 people living out here, and centered on a station on the commuter train line. And right now it's just under 2,000 people who are living here. And as you can see, it used to be green fields, but actually today there's a lot more nature, proper nature, a lot higher biodiversity in this area than there used to be. So they have actually created housing for people, taking up what might look like nature, but actually creating a much higher biodiversity than there used to be. They've also created an area where there's a lot of focus on the social fabric of it. So for instance, all the communal areas, well, actually there is only communal area, because when you walk outside your door, you don't have your own private garden. Everything is, as soon as you leave outside your door, then that is communal, it's everyone's ground. So that's put into system how you work around that and making sure that people get acquainted with each other. They've got mixed housing, so different kinds of, all the different types of housing that we know in Denmark. So social housing, rented housing, and ownership, and so on. That's also completely mixed together to make sure that people get acquainted with each other and they work together. So very idealistic. So the biodiversity is something that they focused on a lot. So every little detail has been taken care of to make sure that we get everywhere we can get biodiversity in. They've even made their own special kind of seed mix for this. So they want to make sure that they have the kinds of seeds for that are typical for this area. So they've got a seed mix which is particularly only to this area, so nowhere else. So they've really tried to make a big effort in making this something special. So water catchment is, of course, a big part of this, and they've made a very innovative scheme in Ny, where they've got their own. They actually try to keep as much water as possible. This is important when you're in a city like Aarhus, which is growing, is when you have more people and you have more water, rainfall, etc., then the sewage system can't handle it. So they've tried here to say, well, actually, why do we try to channel all the water into the big sewage system? Let's try and see if we can keep as much as possible. So they've got their own little water treatment plant here. So keeping pretty much almost everything within this that is generated on the land and in the township of Ny, that is kept in that area. And the water is, of course, reused for all the typical reuses you can use it for in toilets, etc. So that's taken care of as well. The thing about the social fabric is they've got artists also working to try to make sure that it's not just housing and it's not just sustainably built, but you also got this little thing where it's the children that are living in the area or just moving in. So they've been part of this little piece of artwork in the ceiling of one of the passages. So that's little footprints of the children living in the area that has been put into an artwork. So thinking about coherency all the time. Reuse, of course. There's no church out here, and so there was a unused church temporarily brought in from elsewhere. So that's also a kind of way to cope with the temporary stature. Eventually, there might be a sort of proper church, but actually this has become very popular. They like the idea of having something which is reused. So that's the way of thinking all the time. So the main point I want to make here is that that particular town is special actually because it's a private developer. Now here comes the shock, because many in Denmark are a little bit annoyed that this area has been realized by the ownership of a private developer, working closely together with the water treatment company and with the city of Aarhus. But somehow this private investor, he has been able to push all the right buttons. And that's why I think this particular example is so important, because it shows us what can you really do when we try to do all the right things. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Bjarne. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but just maybe a very quick reflection from me. We have spent all morning talking about the green urban transition and focusing on it in a human perspective. And you certainly did some of that in your presentation, but you also brought forward issues of biodiversity, of nature preservation, but also issues related to water and wastewater. And I think that this is perhaps a very interesting and insightful way to end today, and something that we can think about in the future in terms of Nordic collaboration. I work now working with climate scientists at an institute in Norway, and we know that we are facing significant challenges due to climate change. I think the climate adaptation issue and the development and integration of climate adaptation strategies in an urban perspective, including some of the work that you shared in your presentation, is a very important future path of work from an urban planning and urban development perspective throughout the Nordic region. So thank you very much, Bjarne. So, just a few housekeeping issues before I give the final word to the director of Nordregio, Rolf Elmer. We have lunch being served, I believe, just outside from 12 o'clock from now. And then there are a series of excursions. Again, I think you have this information on your name tag. I believe it's called Innovation and Labor Market Mismatch Excursion. They will be meeting at Grønnegata 83, which is somewhere close by, but Grønnegata 83, you can check that on your mobile phone. The Greens Transition and Circular Economy, I believe, is leaving by bus just downstairs from this venue. And the Planning for Green, Healthy and Inclusive Cities, the meeting point is at B-Lab, which is Torgata 63, which I think is just down the path here outside the front doors to the left. So on that note, I would like to thank you all for being here, and I'd like to give the final word to the director of Nordregio, some reflections maybe that you've had on these meetings over the past couple of days, and some thoughts that you have coming out of the activities. Thanks, Rolf.